February 3rd, 1637. A tavern in Haarlem, where tulip traders gathered every week for their regular auction. The room smelled of pipe smoke and beer. Notaries sat ready with their ledgers. Buyers shuffled in as they had for months. But when the auctioneer called the first lot, something broke. No one bid. Not at 5,000 guilders, not at 3,000, not at any price. Bulbs that had sold for the price of a grand canal house the previous week now found 0 buyers. The auctioneer tried again. Silence. He moved to the next lot. Same result. Within days, the market had collapsed 95%. This was not a gradual correction. This was total failure. At peak mania, a single Semper Augustus bulb cost 6,000 guilders. That sum could buy a grand Amsterdam canal house. It could feed a family for 30 years. It was the price people paid for a flower bulb. How does an entire society convince itself that flowers are worth more than homes? Every modern bubble follows the same sequence first documented in 1630s Holland: the displacement that creates value, the contagion that destroys reason, the mechanical collapse that vaporizes fortunes, and the amnesia that ensures we do it again. In 1554, Ogier Geislin de Busbeck arrived in Constantinople as Habsburg ambassador to the court of Suleiman the Magnificent. He came to negotiate a treaty. He left with seeds that would reshape European horticulture. Busbeck's letters describe his first encounter with tulips in the palace gardens, flowers unlike anything he'd seen in Vienna or Brussels.
The tulip has little or no scent, but it is admired for its beauty and the variety of its colors.
The blooms displayed colors European gardens couldn't produce: deep purples, flame-like streaks of red and yellow, petals that seemed to glow. The Ottomans had cultivated tulips for centuries, treating them as symbols of paradise and divine perfection. They bred them deliberately, selecting for intensity and pattern. Busbeck sent seeds to Vienna. From there, they spread through Europe's botanical networks. By 1593, those seeds reached Leiden. Carolus Clusius became director of Leiden University's botanical garden that year. He was among Europe's most respected botanists, methodical, obsessive about classification, protective of his specimens. He planted the tulip seeds Busbeck had collected. The results were immediate. Tulips thrived in Dutch soil, the bulbs multiplied, and Clusius, recognizing their value, refused to sell or share them. This created the first artificial scarcity. In 1596, thieves broke into Clusius's garden at night. They stole bulbs and sold them to wealthy Amsterdam merchants. Clusius was furious. He filed complaints with university authorities. But the theft had consequences he couldn't control. The stolen bulbs became the foundation of Dutch commercial tulip cultivation. Within a decade, gardens across Holland were growing tulips from Clusius's stolen stock. The tulip's appeal was biological, not merely aesthetic. European flowers bloomed in predictable colors: whites, pale pinks, modest yellows. Tulips broke that pattern. They displayed saturated pigments and wild variations. The cause was a mosaic virus that infected the bulbs. When the virus struck, it disrupted pigment production in the petals, creating irregular streaks and flames. Each infected bulb produced unique patterns. No two were identical. Botanists in the 1600s didn't understand viruses. They saw only the result: flowers of extraordinary, unpredictable beauty. They called these specimens broken tulips and prized them above solid-colored varieties. The virus made tulips genuinely scarce. You couldn't engineer a specific pattern. You could only plant bulbs and wait to see what emerged. That waiting took years. A tulip seed required 7 to 12 years to produce a flowering bulb. Even propagating from offsets, small bulbs that grew from mature ones, took 3 to 4 years before the new bulb could flower. This created real scarcity in the 1610s and 1620s. Demand exceeded supply by simple biology. Wealthy merchants wanted tulips for their estates. The supply couldn't expand quickly. Prices rose, but they remained proportional to wealth and status. In 1624, an Amsterdam merchant named Pieter Bol paid 3,000 guilders for a rare Semper Augustus bulb. That sum could buy a modest house. But Bol earned 15,000 guilders annually from his trading ventures. The purchase represented 20% of his annual income, expensive, but not irrational for a status symbol he would display in his garden for decades. He bought the bulb to plant it, to show visitors, to demonstrate his wealth and taste. This was a luxury market, not a speculative one. Then the Dutch economy changed. The 1630s marked the peak of the Dutch Golden Age. Amsterdam controlled global trade routes. The Dutch East India Company generated enormous profits. Merchants accumulated unprecedented wealth. A new merchant class emerged, men who'd made fortunes in shipping, textiles, and finance. They had money, but lacked the inherited status of old nobility. They needed symbols to display their position. Tulips served that purpose perfectly: rare, beautiful, expensive enough to signal wealth. The market expanded, more buyers entered, prices climbed steadily. In 1634, the market's nature shifted. Traders began buying bulbs not to plant them, but to resell them. The transaction became abstract. You didn't need to see the flower. You didn't need to take possession of the bulb. You simply bought a contract promising future delivery. Utility became secondary. The bulb's value derived from what someone else would pay tomorrow. This was the critical transformation, the moment when tulips stopped being flowers and became financial instruments. What followed was inevitable. November 1636. That's when the tulip market stopped being expensive and became insane. A bulb called Wit Kroenen sold for 60 guilders at the start of the month. 4 weeks later, the same variety traded for 1,668 guilders. Not a rare specimen, not a legendary bloom, a common tulip that any merchant could buy. The price had multiplied 27 times in 30 days. Something fundamental had broken in the market's logic. The break wasn't about tulips anymore. It was about a new kind of trade the Dutch called windhandel, wind trade. The term was literal. Traders were buying and selling air. Here's how it worked. A tulip bulb sat in the ground from June through May. You couldn't dig it up without killing it. So instead of trading actual bulbs, merchants traded contracts, promises, a piece of paper that said you owned a bulb still growing in someone's garden. You could buy that paper in November and sell it in January without ever seeing a flower. The paper market exploded because it solved a problem the physical market couldn't. There weren't enough rare bulbs for everyone who wanted to speculate, but there were infinite contracts. You could sell the same bulb 10 times over as long as everyone agreed to keep trading paper. On January 5, 1637, a trader named Pieter Winants walked into a Haarlem tavern with a contract for Jan van Eyck bulbs. He'd bought the contract 3 weeks earlier for 400 guilders. That morning, he sold it for 1,400 guilders. 250% return, 21 days. Winants had never seen the bulbs. The buyer had no intention of planting them. Both men understood they were trading a bet on whether someone else would pay more next week. The taverns became the center of the trade. Dutch tulip speculators organized themselves into clubs called collegias. They met in taverns because taverns had space, beer, and a built-in revenue model. The clubs charged a wine fee. 2.5% of every sale price went to the auctioneer as payment. That fee created a perverse incentive. Auctioneers made more money when prices went higher, so they encouraged aggressive bidding. They celebrated record sales. They mocked conservative traders who wouldn't pay up. The tavern environment added another accelerant: alcohol, social pressure, the feeling that everyone around you was getting rich while you hesitated. To understand how irrational the prices became, you need to translate 1637 guilders into terms that mean something now. A skilled craftsman in Amsterdam earned about 250 guilders per year. That was a good wage, enough to rent a house, feed a family, save a little. When a tulip bulb sold for 3,000 guilders, that represented 12 years of a craftsman's wages. In 2026 terms, the median American worker earns about $60,000 annually. 12 years of wages equals $720,000. People were paying the price of a luxury home for a flower bulb. And it wasn't just wealthy merchants anymore. Contemporary pamphlets describe weavers abandoning their looms, carpenters leaving construction sites, chimney sweeps showing up at tavern auctions with their life savings. A writer named Adrien Roman documented the social contagion in real time. He described entire guilds shutting down because the members were too busy speculating to work. The tulip trade wasn't a side investment. It was consuming people's entire lives. The psychology was documented in a 1637 pamphlet called Dialogue between Weyermont and Gaegoot. The two characters debate whether tulip prices make sense. Gaegoot, the speculator, admits the prices are absurd, but he argues it doesn't matter. There will always be a greater fool, he says. That phrase captures the late-stage bubble mentality. People stopped pretending tulips had intrinsic value. They openly acknowledged they were trading based on momentum. The only thing that mattered was whether someone else would pay more tomorrow. The market ran on leverage and credit, which made the vertical price spike possible. Most traders didn't have thousands of guilders sitting around, so they bought on margin. You could control a 3,000 guilder tulip contract with a 600 guilder down payment, 20% down, 5-to-1 leverage. That leverage multiplied gains on the way up. If you bought a contract for 3,000 guilders with 600 down and the price doubled to 6,000, you'd made 3,000 guilders on a 600 guilder investment, a 500% return. But leverage works both ways. If the price dropped by 20%, you'd lost your entire deposit. Traders also used tulip contracts as collateral to buy more contracts. You'd buy one bulb, watch it appreciate, then borrow against it to buy 3 more. The system required continuous price increases to function. The moment prices stalled, the whole structure became unstable. A merchant named Jan van Dam wrote letters to his brother in Antwerp during the winter of 1636. The letters survive in the Amsterdam city archives. Van Dam describes his mounting anxiety. "My neighbors are getting rich while I stand still," he writes in December. "Every week I delay costs me a year's wages." By January, he'd mortgaged his house to buy tulip futures. That fear of missing out wasn't irrational panic. It was a rational response to watching everyone around you accumulate wealth. If your neighbor bought tulips in November and doubled his money by Christmas, and you didn't, you'd fallen behind. Not participating felt like losing. The peak of the mania produced transactions so absurd they read like satire. The most famous trade involved a single viceroy bulb. The buyer paid with a list of goods instead of cash: 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 barrels of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, a silver beaker. Total value, 2,500 guilders, for 1 tulip bulb. The transaction was recorded by a notary, so we know it actually happened. It wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. Someone genuinely traded a farm's worth of goods for a flower. The price charts from that winter show a market in vertical ascent. The Gorda variety sold for 20 guilders in November 1636. By early February 1637, the same bulb commanded 225 guilders, an 1,125% increase in 10 weeks. That's not appreciation, that's not a bull market, that's a parabolic spike that can only end one way. But in January 1637, no one was thinking about endings. The windhandle system had created a perfect speculative engine: paper contracts detached from physical bulbs, leverage that multiplied gains, social pressure in tavern auctions, the fear of missing permanent wealth, and an entire society that had convinced itself this was normal. Prices were doubling every few weeks. Fortunes were being made by people who'd never owned a tulip. The only question anyone asked was how high it could go. No one was asking what would happen when it stopped. February 3rd, 1637. A Tuesday. The collegium met in a Harlem tavern as they had every week that winter. Traders arrived expecting another round of frenzied bidding. They carried contracts for bulbs still buried in frozen ground. They anticipated the usual pattern: prices climbing, wine flowing, everyone getting richer on paper. Instead, no one bid. The auctioneer called out the first lot. Silence. He lowered the opening price. More silence. He tried another bulb, then another. The room stayed quiet, not because buyers lacked money or interest. They had simply stopped believing. That moment, that specific Tuesday in that specific tavern, marked the instant an entire market discovered it had been trading in delusion. The collapse had no trigger, no government ban, no external shock, no bad harvest or foreign invasion. The market simply reached the point where one more person looked at the price and thought, "This makes no sense." Then another person had the same thought. Then everyone did. The mechanical failure happened fast. The windhandle system, the futures market that had driven prices vertical, required continuous buyer demand to function. Every contract assumed someone would pay more next week. When the Harlem auction failed to clear, the assumption broke. Traders held contracts to buy bulbs at prices no one would now pay. Sellers held contracts to deliver bulbs no one would now accept. The entire chain of obligations became unenforceable in a single afternoon. What followed was price collapse at a speed that stunned even the pessimists. The Switzer variety had sold for 60 guilders on February 1st. By February 10th, it traded at 5 guilders, a 92% loss in 9 days. Witt Krunen bulbs, common whites, that had reached 1,668 guilders in January now found 0 buyers at 100 guilders. The Semper Augustus, the most coveted tulip in Holland, had peaked at 6,000 guilders. By mid-February, the few transactions that occurred happened at 300 guilders, then 100, then nothing. The margin call cascade amplified the destruction. Traders had bought bulbs with 10 or 20% down payments. They had used leverage to multiply their positions. When prices fell, they suddenly owed money for bulbs worth less than their deposits. A trader who bought a bulb for 1,000 guilders with 200 guilders down now faced a choice: pay the remaining 800 guilders for something worth 50 guilders or default on the contract. Most chose default. The defaults triggered a liquidity crisis that paralyzed commerce. Sellers discovered they owned bulbs they could not sell at any price. Buyers realized they owed money for contracts they could not fulfill. Notaries recorded thousands of disputes. Merchants who had been wealthy on paper in January filed for bankruptcy in March. The courts faced an impossible problem. How do you enforce contracts when both parties lack the means to settle? How do you value a commodity that has no buyers? Abraham de Goya's case illustrates the wreckage. His bankruptcy filing showed debts of 14,000 guilders on tulip contracts. His actual assets totaled 1,200 guilders. The contracts he held, futures for bulbs he had planned to resell, were now worthless paper. He was not alone. Guild records document similar filings across Haarlem, Amsterdam, and Utrecht. The authorities attempted intervention. On February 24th, city officials convened an emergency meeting in Amsterdam. They proposed voiding all contracts signed after November 16, 36. When that proved legally questionable, they suggested settling contracts at 10% of face value. The proposals created more chaos. Buyers who had already paid deposits demanded refunds. Sellers who had delivered bulbs demanded full payment. The legal framework had no mechanism for unwinding a speculative bubble. The crash was total because tulip futures had no floor value. When stock markets collapse, shares retain some residual worth. Companies still own assets. They still generate revenue. A stock trading at $100 might fall to $10, but it rarely falls to zero. Tulip futures were different. They represented contracts for flowers. The bulbs had modest decorative value, perhaps 10 or 20 guilders for rare varieties if you actually wanted to plant them. But 95% of tulip market value had been pure speculation. When speculation evaporated, so did 95% of the price. The social aftermath arrived quickly. Pamphleteers published screeds condemning the mania as divine punishment for greed. Sermons referenced the tulip crash as evidence of human folly. Artists produced satirical prints showing tulip traders as fools wearing jester caps, dancing with devils. The most famous pamphlet, Flora's Fool's Cap, depicted the goddess Flora presiding over a tavern full of idiots throwing money at flowers. The message was clear: you were warned, you chose delusion, you deserve ruin. But the economic damage proved surprisingly contained. Most tulip transactions had been futures contracts between speculators. The mania had not destroyed Dutch banking systems or disrupted core trade networks. The East India Company continued operating. Textile exports proceeded normally. Amsterdam remained Europe's financial center. The crash ruined individual fortunes: weavers who had quit their trades, merchants who had leveraged their businesses, craftsmen who had bet their savings. But it did not collapse the Dutch economy. That Tuesday in Haarlem, when the bidding stopped, revealed a simple truth. Prices built on collective belief collapse the instant belief falters. No force on earth can sustain a market when participants simultaneously realize they have been trading in wind. The bulbs remained in the ground. The flowers would bloom that spring as beautiful as ever. But the fortunes were gone. The morning after a financial collapse always looks the same. Merchants who days earlier celebrated paper fortunes now stared at contracts they couldn't honor. Weavers who'd abandoned their looms discovered they owed money they'd never possessed. The tulip bulbs remained in the ground, unchanged, while the fantasy built atop them had simply evaporated. The actual economic damage was surprisingly contained. Most Tulipmania transactions existed as futures contracts between speculators. Real money rarely changed hands. The windhandle system operated on promises and paper, not cash settlements. When prices collapsed, the damage concentrated among those who'd played the game, not the broader Dutch economy. Amsterdam's banking houses survived intact. The merchant fleet continued its trade routes. The East India Company posted record profits in 1637. The core economy proved resilient because it had never truly participated. Dutch courts faced an impossible problem. Thousands of contract disputes flooded the legal system. Buyers refused to honor futures agreements. Sellers demanded payment for bulbs now worthless. The courts needed a resolution that wouldn't bankrupt half the merchant class. Their solution was elegant. They declared tulip contracts gambling debts. Under Dutch law, gambling obligations carried no legal weight. A bet made in a tavern couldn't be enforced through the courts. By categorizing tulip futures as wages rather than legitimate commerce, judges allowed participants to walk away from their obligations. The ruling meant sellers couldn't collect, but buyers didn't have to pay. It was a legal amnesty disguised as moral judgment. The cultural scar cut deeper than the financial wound. Morality plays appeared in Amsterdam theaters depicting tulip traders as jesters wearing fool's caps, dancing with the devil. Sermons condemned the mania as divine punishment for greed. A 1638 pamphlet titled Flora's Fool's Cap showed elaborately dressed merchants riding a wagon pulled by fools toward a cliff. The goddess Flora, symbol of flowers and spring, wore a jester's costume. The message was unsubtle. Those who worshipped flowers instead of God would meet ruin. Yet the memory proved remarkably short. Within a single generation, the visceral fear faded. By 1660, young merchants who'd been children during the crash entered business. They'd heard stories about Tulipmania, certainly, but stories lacked the emotional weight of lived experience. The pain belonged to their parents' generation, not theirs. This created what historians now call the amnesia clock. Financial memory operates on a 20 to 30-year cycle. It takes roughly one generation for the survivors of a crash to age out of active participation in markets. New investors arrive with fresh confidence, unburdened by trauma they never experienced. They know the history intellectually, but don't feel it emotionally. This gap between knowing and feeling makes the next bubble possible. The Dutch proved this pattern. 83 years after Tulipmania, the Dutch participated enthusiastically in the Mississippi Scheme and South Sea Bubble. Both followed identical patterns: exotic new investments, vertical price spikes, promises of endless wealth, sudden collapse. The 1720 crashes devastated fortunes across Europe, including Amsterdam. Yet the Dutch investors of 1720 had no emotional connection to the tulip crash of 1637. Their grandparents had lived through it. They had not. The pattern would repeat with mechanical regularity. Modern neuroscience explains why we can't learn from financial history. During speculative frenzies, brain imaging shows the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, floods with dopamine and overrides the prefrontal cortex, which handles risk assessment. The feeling that this time is different isn't a rational conclusion. It's a neurological state. The brain literally experiences the mania as a new phenomenon, even when the pattern is ancient.